Have our young ushers pass out the lesson sheets this morning. Genesis chapter number 30. It is good to see each one of you here this morning, and it is Palm Sunday. I'm looking forward to the day today, looking forward to the week this week, and looking forward to next week as well. You know, we celebrate, we come to church on Sunday because that is the day of the week that Jesus rose from the dead. And really, every Sunday is a celebration of his resurrection. But I'm thankful for a day that we still set aside every year to remember that and to reflect on that. I'm looking forward to a special day next week, but don't want to miss this week as well, okay? Appreciate each one that prayed for the rummage giveaway, those that were a part of that. Over the course of Friday and Saturday, there were over 150 people that came through the rummage giveaway. Tremendous showing out. A bunch of people showed up. It was a good thing. And all right, we were here on Friday morning, and by the time we were ready to open the door, there were already 20, 25 people in a line waiting down the sidewalk, and it was exciting. And so I appreciate those that are part of that. And several have indicated they'd like to come back to the services, so keep praying and have some follow-ups that we can do. I'll say more about that. If you'd like to be a part of that, come let me know. But it's been a busy week. I was talking to somebody on Wednesday night. They said, Pastor, how was your week? I said, good, it's busy. I'd like to know the guy who planned the rummage giveaway, Easter Sunday, and all this stuff all at the same time. If I get a hold of him, I'm going to tell him a thing or two. It's been a busy week, a work day, but it's a busy season, and April will be a little bit slower for us, and we can rest then, okay? Lesson 26b, we're still dealing with this matter of Jacob leaving Laban. We started this last week, and we're going to continue this transition. He makes plans to leave. We saw that at the beginning of the lesson last week, and then he begins that actual implementation of the plan of leaving Laban. We saw that he did so secretly. Again, I stand by the fact I think he was wise to do that. Laban had been very tricky in his business dealings with Jacob, and so Jacob leaves secretly. Laban eventually finds out that he's gone, and he begins to pursue after him. And that's where we're going to kind of pick up the story today, beginning in chapter number 25. Verse number 25 of chapter 31. I think I may have told you chapter 30, but we're in chapter number 31. All right? So chapter 31, beginning in verse number 25, we're going to pick up the story. If you remember where we left off, God has appeared to Laban through the night there, said, don't harm Jacob, leave him alone, don't be difficult with him. And so we pick up in verse number 25, the Bible says this, Then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, What hast thou done that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, and carried away my daughters as captives taken with the sword? Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly, and steal away from me, and didst not tell me, that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, with tabret, and with harp? I don't believe him. All right, just saying that. All right, verse number 28. And hast thou not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters? Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. Here's Laban's true heart in this verse number 29. Is it in the power of my hand to do you hurt? In other words, I could make your life difficult if I want to. Verse 29 goes on, but the God of your fathers spake unto me yesternight, saying, Take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. And now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house, yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? And I think really, and again, this is my opinion, I think Laban is pursuing after Jacob more to get his gods back than his closeness with his family. And so we find letter C here where we pick up the study. I find that Laban lies and boasts as usual. Laban's character is to be deceptive, to lie, to boast, to put things bigger than they are, and really to use diversion tactics quite a bit. And we find that being the case here in this section. Number one, under letter C, we find that he pretends that Jacob has stolen his daughters and his goods. It's interesting to me, in verse 26, Laban's talking to Jacob, and he says, You've stolen away, unawares to me, carried away my daughters as captives taken with the sword. That's not really the case. really, if you find out, Laban had given his daughters to Jacob. They were Jacob's wives. Yes, they're still Laban's daughters. I understand that. And this is really, I think, some of the advantage that you find when a husband, when the Bible talks about, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife. I think you can find great benefit in putting a little bit of distance between the one family unit and the other family unit. And not that it has to be miles and miles and miles, but I'm saying when they were living in the same house, life is always more difficult. I've yet to really find an experience where that works perfectly in my own observation. But here's the thing. Jacob says, it's time for me and my family to separate. Laban says, you've stolen my daughters away. And so he accuses him of stealing his daughters, stealing his goods. Number two, the reality was that Jacob had faithfully served Laban for a number of years, and I'll give you the number here in just a moment, for a number of years, and Laban had been the one trying to cheat Jacob. How long had Jacob served Laban? The total is 20 years. In fact, if you look down at verse number 41, you find he says, thus have I been 20 years in thy house. And he breaks it down. I served thee 14 years for thy two daughters, 7 for Leah, 7 for, well, he thought it was for Rachel and got Leah, then another 7 for Rachel herself. So there's the 14 years for his two wives, and 6 years for thy cattle, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. What Jacob's saying here, and we'll get to this as we go through there, Jacob is saying, Laban, I have lived with you in your house there. I've served you for 20 years. In 20 years, you've changed my wages 10 different times. On average, those of you that are math experts, what does that work out to? Every 2 years, Laban is changing the wages. And you find that, we looked at that a little bit last week, where Jacob says, if you said, hey, the ring straight are going to be mine, then that was that case. And then you would change it, and then you would change this, and then you would change that, and change this. And it was always in flux, and Laban was always looking to take advantage of Jacob in that way. And so we find that was the reality, that Jacob had served him faithfully, and really Laban had been the one trying to cheat Jacob. Number 3, we find that Leah and Rachel had already testified that Laban acted like a stranger to them. Earlier in the passage, when Jacob comes to his wives and says, hey, it's time to leave, they answer in verse number 14 and say to Jacob, is there any portion of or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not counted of him strangers? For he hath sold us and hath quite devoured also our money. There's really nothing left. This relationship has fallen apart, and so they give testimony to that. Whereas Laban is saying, hey, it's a close relationship. You've stolen them away from me, and you see the difference there. Letter D, we find that Jacob in this next passage here, beginning in verse number 31 and really going down through verse number 43 or so, Jacob uses some very bold words. He's reached a point where he has finally decided it's time to leave. It's time to leave Laban's house. He has God's word on the matter, and he begins to step away from that. Laban now has tracked him down, and he's trying to get him to come back, and Jacob has to take a stand and speak some things very boldly. He does so, I think, on both sides here. He does so for good. He also does so to his hurt. Number 1, I find that Jacob uses bold words, and he makes a hasty and a rash vow. We find that in these very next verses. He makes a hasty and a rash vow. Laban has just accused Jacob of stealing his goods. In verse number 31, Jacob responds. Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid. That because I was afraid, I don't think is an answer to the question of why did you steal my gods. I think it's an answer to the question of that Laban asks earlier on, why did you flee secretly? Why did you get away so quickly without telling me? And I think Jacob reveals, I was afraid, I was fearful. He goes on, I was afraid, for I said, peradventure, thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me. He's afraid that Laban is going to be, if he's changed his wages 10 times in 20 years, what's to keep Laban from changing his mind and saying, no, you can't have my daughters. No, you can't take my grandchildren with you. No, you can't take your flocks or your herds. Laban had much more loyalty to him there in that family section than Jacob did. So Jacob says, I left that way. I was afraid. Verse 32. With whomsoever, here's the rash vow that he makes, with whomsoever thou findest the gods, let him, what? Not live. Now, who has the gods? Rachel has them. Does Jacob know that? I don't think he does. If Jacob knew that Rachel had the gods, I don't think he would have said this. All right, but he makes a hasty, if you find them, whoever you find that has them, they're not going to live. He goes on, verse number 32. Before our brethren, discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee, for Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. And Laban went into Jacob's tent, into Leah's tent, into the two maidservants' tents, but he found them not. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. I think in between there you have a little parentheses, and Rachel was sweating a lot, all right? But it's not in there, okay? That's just my little commentary. Verse number 34. Now Rachel had taken the images and put them in the camel's furniture and sat upon them. And Laban searched all the tent, but found them not. And she said to her father, let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. And he searched, but found not the images. She's hidden them, she's stolen them, she's hidden them, she's deceptive about where they're at. And so we find all these things taking place. Number one, we found that under letter D, we found that Jacob makes this hasty vow, this rash vow. Letter A, we find that Rachel really, in essence, lies to her fathers to hide her sin. She's being deceptive. She's being tricky in that way of, I can't get up. And really, she has them hidden, I believe, underneath her to whereby he could not find them. So she's deceptive about it. She's possessing of them. And we find, really, letter B, that shortly after that, she dies. Here in chapter number 31, we're going to read the rest of the story. But you go over to chapter 35, not a lot of time is going to transpire between these two chapters. In chapter 35, beginning in verse number 16, we find that as they journeyed from Bethel, there was but a little way to come to Ephrath, and Rachel travailed, and she had hard labor. And it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said unto her, fear not, thou shalt have this son also. And it came to pass, as her soul was in departing, for she died, that she called his name Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin. And Rachel died and was buried in the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. Interestingly, Jacob makes this vow. Whoever has them is going to die. Rachel does die shortly thereafter. So he uses these bold words to make a hasty vow. Number two, Jacob also uses bold words to call out Laban. And you reach a point here where there's a balance in all things. I just preached Wednesday night on meekness. But again, meekness is not weakness. There's a difference here. And Jacob is, I believe, laying out to Laban, there are sufficient grounds for you and I to separate from each other. Here are the reasons. Laban's already listed out some false reasons, some false accusations against Jacob. And Jacob in this next passage is going to say, no, those aren't the reasons that I've had to separate from you. These are the reasons that I've had to separate from you. And we find that beginning in verse number 36. Jacob was wroth and chode with Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin that thou hast so hotly pursued after me? Now, Laban, what's the relationship between Laban and Jacob? Laban is Jacob's what? All right, I thought we'd get a little more agreement in this. Laban is Jacob's father-in-law. What else is Laban Jacob's? Employer. He's my boss, right? Did you ever walk into your boss's office and say, what did I do wrong? You might have an interesting conversation that way. I remember one particular time I was working at the cabinet shop, and I had a project I was working on, a big, huge 17-foot long display that we were building. And I had asked a couple of guys if they would stay about 10 minutes after quitting time just to help me flip that thing over. And they didn't, oh, no, we're going home, or we're going here, or we're going there, we won't stay. And it had to be done that evening. 10 minutes was all it took. And so I was out there in the shop working on this, and my direct boss was getting ready to leave, and I had just finished flipping this cabinet up on its side all by myself. Was a little bit nervous it was going to break in the process, and I had gotten up, and I was sweating, and I was red, and I was upset. I was wroth. And the boss said to me, he said, what's wrong? And I said, nothing. You just go on home, have a great day. Well, I'll see you in the morning. And he said, no, something's wrong. And I said, it'll be better in the morning. And he said, no, something's wrong. He set his laptop bag down, never forget, set his laptop bag down there on the workbench, and he sat on my workbench. He said, I'm not leaving until you tell me. And I thought, you asked. You picked the wrong time. And I just laid out to him. I said, listen. And I explained to him at that time, I was still making a pretty low wage, had taken a lot of responsibility. And I said to him, it's getting to the point where it's just not worth it anymore. I kind of laid out some things that I had done, and I said, does anybody notice? Does anybody I was upset. I wasn't in a right spirit. I wasn't in a right attitude. And he said, we'll talk about this tomorrow. I said, that was my whole point. It'll be better tomorrow. And so he went home, and I went home, and I came back the next morning. I was working at my workbench, and the owner of the company came out about 30 minutes after starting time, and he came by my workbench. He said, I just want to let you know we raised your rate $2 an hour. I said, I appreciate that. And I just kept working. But here's the thing. Laban's, and I'm not advising that, okay? That can backfire on you too. But I'm saying, Laban comes to his boss and says, what have I done that's wrong? Here you are. You're accusing me of these things. What is my trespass? Why have you pursued after me? And he gives some reasons in verse number 37. Whereas thou hast searched all my stuff, what hast thou found of thy household stuff? Set it here before my brethren and thy brethren, that they may judge betwixt us both. He says, father-in-law Laban, find what I've done that's wrong. Lay it out here. I've specifically, what we did with the flocks, I separated them so that they're visually identifiable. Find something that I've taken that belongs to you. And he's basically declaring, I have been a man of integrity. Lay it out here. Let us see it. In verses 36 and 37, he calls out Laban for falsely accusing him. In verse number 38, I find he calls out Laban for overlooking Jacob's service. That's letter B there under number 2, for overlooking Jacob's service. Verse 38, Jacob says this, these 20 years have I been with thee. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. He's saying, Laban, I've served you for 20 years. I've looked over the well-being of your flocks. Jacob had not been a lazy shepherd. Jacob had been very attentive to that. He had been very wise in what he did and what his wages were and things of that nature. Laban had overlooked Jacob's service. Letter C, he calls out Laban for overlooking Jacob's sacrifice. Not only had he served, but Jacob had actually sacrificed things that Laban would have never known. Verse number 39, that which was torn of beasts, I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was. In the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. He says, I've sacrificed. If something got hurt, if something got damaged, if something got destroyed, I took that out of my paycheck. Now, he's not looking for accolades. He's not looking for a gold star. He's not looking for a plaque to hang on his wall or his camel or wherever they hung their plaques back then. I don't know, his tent wall. He's just saying, you need to know some things. There's some sacrifices that I have made that you've overlooked. Letter D, he calls out Laban for overlooking his salary. That's your blank there, his salary, verse number 41. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, 6 years for thy cattle, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Jacob makes it very clear. I'm going to keep going. I have to keep going this morning. Letter E. He calls out Laban for overlooking Jacob's security. In verse number 42, except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely thou hadst sent me away now what? Empty. That was the character of Laban. Laban was a taker. And Jacob says, had it not been for God, you would have sent me away without any of my wives, without any of my children, without any of my possessions. You would have totally destroyed me as you sent me away. He goes on, says this, God hath seen my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked thee yesternight. He says, Mr. Laban, I love you. I respect you in that to a degree because of your position, but you need to know these are the facts. God has been looking out for me. And he lays those things out, and we find number 3 there, that he uses these bold words with no change to Laban's character. Look what Laban says. Laban's a smooth talker. Verse 43, Laban answered and said unto Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is what? Mine. Okay, put yourself in Jacob's sandals here, right? He's fled for his life with his family, with his possessions that he spent 20 years growing, and he stands there, and he uses bold words to Laban. He explains the situation, and Laban says, look at everything you see. Everything you see is mine. But yet, Laban had just said, a chapter before, I've seen that God has prospered me because of you. Where would Laban be without Jacob? And so we find this strife going here, no change to his character. He goes on in verse number 43, and what can I do this day unto these my daughters, or unto their children, which they have borne? And then we find he makes this statement in verse number 44, now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. I find letter E that Jacob makes a covenant with Laban. This goes all the way down through verse number 55. I'm going to read the verses very quickly, and then we'll make some of the points. Verse number 45, and Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar, and Jacob said unto his brethren, gather stones, and they took stones and made an heap. And they did eat there upon the heap. And Laban called it a big long name. But Jacob called it Gilead. And Laban said, the heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it called Gilead and Mizpah. For he said, the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another. Now let me ask you a question. How many have ever seen that phrase on a plaque or something like that? The Lord watch between me and thee. Okay, we're going to come back to that, all right? Number 50. If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou... I don't have a plaque like that in my house. I'll explain why here in just a minute, okay? If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives besides my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness betwixt me and thee. And Laban said to Jacob, behold this heap, and behold this pillar, which I have cast betwixt me and thee. The heap be witness, and this pillar be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for harm. The Lord God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge betwixt us. And Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac. And Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount, and called his brethren to eat bread, and they did eat bread, and tarried all night in the mount. And early in the morning Laban rose up, and kissed his sons and his daughters, and blessed them. And Laban departed, and returned unto his place. Jacob makes this covenant with Laban. Number one, I believe he's wise to accept the window for peace. Jacob is wise to accept this window of peace. Laban has just finished saying, everything you see is mine, but you know what? He goes on in verse 44. He continues his saying, now let's make a covenant. Jacob doesn't say, no. I've got some terms you have to meet before I make this covenant. Jacob sees, here's a window for peace, and he takes it. No, Laban hasn't done right by me these last 20 years. No, he's not right in this moment, but he's willing to make a term of peace. He's willing to make this separation, and he takes that window. He jumps into it. Letter A under number 1. We are commanded to do what we can to be at peace with all men. Romans 12, if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Is that an easy command to obey sometimes? No, you're going to have people that are hard to get along with. But there's a need for us to work at living peaceably one with another. Proverbs 20, verse 3 speaks to that as well. Letter B, Jacob does not wait for Laban to fully validate him. You know why? Because that was never going to happen. I'll finish my phrase there. Letter B, Jacob does not wait for Laban to fully validate him. He takes the open door to separate peaceably. There is some strong strife, some strong division between Laban and Jacob. The window opens up for them to separate peaceably, and Jacob says, I am going through this window. If I'm waiting for Laban to come around and say, you know what, Jacob, you were right this whole time, that's never going to happen. Right? It's probably not going to happen. Laban's going to be stuck in his own ways. Laban's seeing it from his own direction, and there's a need for them to separate peaceably. Letter C, Jacob encourages all to participate in verse number 46. The Bible says, Jacob said unto his brethren, hey, fellas, you get some stones. This isn't just between me and Laban. This is between all of us. You need to be a part of this. And I think he realizes that they need to be involved because they were part of the cause that Jacob recognized. Listen, my brothers are against me. Laban's against me. There's a need to separate. And he makes this a broader covenant than just between him and Laban. Second side of our lesson sheet this morning, number 2, we find that Jacob and Laban name this monument. And we find 2 names given to it, letter A, that both mean a heap of testimony. The long word, Jegar Sahad, or whatever you say that, I'm not fluent in Chaldean, and that is the Chaldean name for a heap of testimony. That would be the name that Laban used. The Hebrew word would have been galid, and that simply meant the same thing, a heap or a pile that is a testimony, that is a witness between you and I. It's a monument, it's a memorial that marks something specific. I remember when we were getting ready to purchase our house where we live, and you drive up through the cornfields there to get up to the house, towards where our house is at, and there's a marker, there's a monument that sits right there along the east side of that road. And I remember kind of slowing down and reading that. That's where the first airport in Sangamon County was. That field was an airport. It's a marker. If that marker had not been there, I probably would have never known that was, I still don't really care, but I would have never known that was where the first airport in Sangamon County was. But there's a marker there. There's a heap that is giving testimony to what that parcel of land had been used for at one point. This pile of stones that they make, they both name it. This is a heap. It's a pile of a testimony marking something important. They also name it, in verse number 49, Mizpah. And this, again, is a Hebrew word that Jacob assigns to this. And the word Mizpah means a watchtower, not the watchtower, that's different. A watchtower, all right? And so this is literally a tower that is watching. It was a reminder of several things, letter B. It was a reminder under letter B that God was watching them. He says here in verse number 49, he calls it Mizpah, for he said, the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another. Now, I know people use that verse, they hang it on their house, and my relative's here and my other relative's over there, and God's going to watch between all of us. That's true. I get all that. I don't really hang it on my house because I know where this verse comes from. It's really a verse that is based in mutual distrust. Under letter B, it's constructed as a testimony to mutual distrust. Jacob saying, Laban, I don't trust you to not come over here and take my people. Laban saying, I don't trust you to not come over here and do whatever. I don't know. And so they build this monument, they build this heap of stones saying, I don't trust you and I don't trust you, and so we're not going to cross this line. That's what this is all about. It's not about families coming together. It's about a separation that needed to take place. And they call it Mizpah, a watchtower of mutual distrust. Number 3, Jacob and Laban swear an oath in verse number 53. The God of Abraham, well, and you find that it's built on mutual distrust. Verse number 52, this heap be witness, and this pillar be witness, that I shall not pass over this heap to thee. Thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me. What are the last 2 words? For harm. It's not for a family reunion. It's that I don't trust that you're not going to harm me, and so we're putting the separation between us. That's what they build it there for. They swear an oath in verse number 53. The God of Abraham, Nahor, the God of their father, judge betwixt us, and Jacob swear by the fear of his father Isaac. Again, you say, why is he swearing by the fear of his father? I think it's just a reference to the fact that he's swearing by God himself. Number 4, we find that Jacob offers a sacrifice and hosts a time of fellowship that was very common when a covenant was being made. They had a sacrifice there, and then they would eat together to kind of confirm and to seal that covenant. Then in verse number 55, we find that Laban leaves, and he begins to return unto his place. And so this is really kind of, the story shifts from Jacob and Laban. Laban has now left. He returns to his place, and the story continues on in chapter number 32, just following Jacob. And we're going to look at just the first 2 verses of chapter 32 this morning and kind of introduce a thought here, and then we'll pick up here again in 2 weeks. The Bible says this in verses 1 and 2 of chapter number 32. And Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's host." For he called the name of that place Mahanaim. Number 3 there in your lesson sheet, Jacob meets the angels of God. Do you think the end of chapter 31 was kind of a stressful time in Jacob's life? I would submit that it was. He has to leave. He has to run. He gets 3 days journey before Laban finds out about it. A week later, Laban catches up with him. They have this conversation. They have this discussion. They build this monument. They have separated. And as Laban goes, they're leaving in mutual distrust of each other. Jacob continues on, and suddenly he's met by the angels of God. Letter A, Jacob is not met by one angel alone, but rather he is met by a host of angels. We find it in verse number 2 that he refers to it as God's host. And I don't know all the details. There's a part of me that wishes we had a lot more details on this particular encounter. But letter B, when Jacob sees them, he knows exactly who they are, and he calls them God's host. You know, people having a fascination with angels today. I think they look like this and they look like that. And really, I think a lot of what people think about angels you won't even find it biblically. But Jacob, he sees them, he recognizes them, he's able to identify them immediately as God's host. Letter C, we're not told much about the interaction, other than it causes Jacob to name the place Mahanaim. And the word Mahanaim means this, it means double camp. Double camp, or two camps. Now, could that be that there was a host of angels on this side and a host of angels on that side of where he was at? Could it mean that there were two separate hosts? There could be a number of different things. I'll give you a couple of different ideas here under letter C. Number one, this could be a reference to God's guarding of Jacob both in Haran when he was with Laban and also in Canaan when he was with Esau. This is a watershed moment for Jacob. Jacob is going from being with Laban to being on his own. He's returning back to Canaan. Canaan is the land of promise. He's returning back to where he has been called. He's following God's leading. When he left Canaan, why did he leave Canaan? Because Esau was going to kill him. He's running from his problem, if I can call it that. He spends time in Haran. He spends 20 years there. Rather than that problem going away, he picks up another problem. A couple problems, actually, along the way. But Laban becomes a big problem. Now he's kind of in between, running from this problem, and he's going to run right back into his old problem later in chapter number 32, Esau. And we find him there in the middle, and he calls it double camp. Could be a reference to that. Number two, this protection of God is the fulfillment of God's promise in chapter 31, verse 3. I love that promise that God gave to Jacob. He says, return to the land of thy fathers, to thy kindred. I will be with thee. I'll be there. And God manifests that. God displays that right here. He allows Jacob to see the host of angels. Letter D. Why did God send these angels? I believe God sent the angels to Jacob for two main reasons. First of all, I think he sent them to encourage and to minister to Jacob. To encourage and to minister to Jacob. We find throughout Scriptures God doing this different times, sending his angels to encourage and to minister to his people. In Matthew chapter number 4, we find the angels ministered to Jesus after his temptation in the wilderness. And we could take time, we could look that up. I preached on the temptation of Christ a couple Sunday mornings ago. And the Bible says after the devil left him for a season, the angels came, they ministered to him. Letter B, we find that there was an angel that came and ministered to Paul. He was on a ship. The ship was being beaten in the storm. And if you remember the account there in Acts chapter number 27, he gives a commentary to those on the ship. He says, hey, the angel of the Lord was with me last night. I serve him. I'm faithful to him. I'm loyal to him. I'm obedient to him. And he revealed to me that we're going to be okay. The ship is not going to be the greatest, but we'll survive this. Here he is. He's in the midst of shipwreck. He's in the midst of the storm, and yet God sends his angel, I believe, to encourage and to minister to Paul. Letter C, we find the presence of angels encouraging the heart of the servant of Elisha. In 2 Kings chapter 16 and 17, this is the account where Elisha, I think it's the Syrians, if I remember right, are coming and they're hunting him down and they're trying to take his life. And Elisha's servant wakes up early in the morning. I think it was to make the coffee for Elisha before he got up. But I don't see that completely in there. That's just my idea there. But he wakes up in the morning, he looks out the window, and they're surrounded by an army. And he knows that they're coming after one man, and this servant is connected to that man because he's his servant. And I'm sure there were all kinds of thoughts that went through his mind. Do I just, turn him in? Do I just stick a white flag up out the house here? What do I do? And he says to Elisha, he says, they're all around us. We're surrounded. There's no chance for us to get out. How shall we do? What shall we do? And Elisha prays and asks God to open the eyes of his servant. And the servant is able to see beyond, camped around the host that was camped around them, were God's angels and God's fire angels in that situation. Number two, I think the second reason that God sent these angels to Jacob was to remind Jacob of God's presence. To remind Jacob, number two there, of God's presence. And this isn't the presence like you get at Christmas time. This is his presence, his being there. Jacob, no doubt, having left Laban, would have been tempted to feel that he was all on his own. He would have been left to feel very vulnerable. He had wives, he had children, he had flocks and herds. They could only travel so quickly. He had a father-in-law that was set against him. And he's heading back towards Canaan. He knows that Esau is still in that vicinity. He's in between this. He's definitely feeling very susceptible, very vulnerable at this case in time. I think God reminds Jacob of his presence by sending these angels. Letter A, Jacob has just come out of a severe trial and needs to experience the comfort of God's presence. My friend, there are so many times, I'm so thankful throughout my life, there have been times where going through a severe trial, God brings you through that. He brings the comfort of his Holy Spirit into your life. The comfort, not that I've seen a real angel come and sit down at my desk and say, this is going to be okay. But the Holy Spirit of God will bring that comfort to you. His Word will bring that comfort to you. And here for Jacob, he brings that comfort. He had just come out of a severe trial. He was, I remember a time in ministry there, going back even before we were here, and we had gone through a severe ministry trial. And we came back at the end of that and just said, hey, I just kind of feel like we're spiritually fragile, for lack of a better term. What did God do? God ministered to us at that time. He built us back up at that time. He's so faithful to do that, to bring comfort at that time. Letter B, Jacob has just left Laban, and he needs to experience the guidance of God's presence. Not only the comfort of God's presence, but the guidance of God's presence. Laban has been left behind. Jacob is returning to Canaan land, and Jacob has a decision to make. He says, okay, I need to know where to go. God is willing to guide him. God is willing to direct him. God's actually going to guide and direct him right back into Esau's lap. We'll see that in a couple of weeks here. But he needs to experience the guidance of God's presence. Then letter C, and lastly this morning, Jacob has just come to the point of anticipating reuniting with Esau, and needs to experience the power of God's presence as well. Not only his comfort, not only his guidance, but also the power of God's presence. Listen, when you are walking with God, you can be assured, you can be confident of his power upon your life. Now, that's not always an easy path to walk. It's not always an easy direction to walk. But it is one that comes with great power. And Jacob has come to this point. He's separated from Laban. He's beginning to look to return to Canaan. And God sends his angels to appear to Jacob. And when he sees them, he recognizes them as the Lord's host. He calls the place double host for whatever reason. And then we're going to find, beginning verse number 3, Jacob sends messengers before him to Esau, his brother, unto the land of Seir, the country of Edom. Jacob says, hey, Esau's on the horizon. I need to kind of jump ahead of this. I need to anticipate this. I need to be prepared for this. And he has an interaction with Esau. We'll pick up there, not next week. That's Easter Sunday, but the following week after that, we'll jump back in again, all right? To ask the Lord's blessing on our services to follow.